Welcome to Capital Dateline Online. I'm with our guest, Jim Saunders, Executive Editor of the News Service of Florida. Jim, hard to believe, but we're already going into the fourth week of the legislative session, which is basically a halfway point. And the big deal, the thing that has to be passed, is the budget. How far apart are the House and the Senate at this point?
Well, the House and Senate have released their initial budget proposals. Still got to go through a couple more steps. Big picture, they're roughly $1 billion apart. The House around 80 billion, the Senate's around 81. Those big numbers are always a little deceiving because a lot of stuff gets built into it. But I think there's a couple takeaways at this point. I think the big issue to resolve going forward is going to be on Governor Scott's economic incentives and his tax cuts. He has proposed and is pushing very hard for roughly $1 billion in tax cuts and $250 million for economic development incentives. The House and Senate have taken sort of interesting stances on that. The House has gone with $1 billion tax cut package, and the Senate has gone with $250 million in economic development incentives.
So they're both doing what the governor wants.
Well, in different ways.
Yes.
So the question, I guess, is how they will meet in the middle, or how they will resolve that. I don't think either. Especially the House tax cut package is not exactly the way the governor wanted it. I mean, for instance, he wants to give some corporate income, substantial corporate income taxes, and the House is not on board with that at this point. But their number is in the same ballpark as his, and so the big question is how they're going to resolve. In my mind, the big question is how they resolve that gulf and make him happy. Because he has been out there making this his priorities, pair of priorities for the session, and he's out there beating the drum every day on it. So that's really going to be the most difficult, biggest sticking point at this, going into the negotiations that will ensue over the next few weeks.
And we were talking about one thing that may come out of it is student funding on the rise?
Yeah, I think one thing that will happen is that they will be able to go out and campaign this fall and say that they have given record per student funding for public schools. This was something Governor Scott campaigned on in his reelection campaign a couple years ago, and he made it a priority then. They couldn't get to that number last year, but it looks like that is very likely to happen this year. A lot of that is driven by local property taxes. In the school funding formula, it's a very complicated formula, but part of what goes into that formula is local property taxes, and there's been a lot of growth in that. So the legislature is able to use that growth to help increase the per student funding. Now there's questions about whether they should do that. But I think in the end, I think you're going to see a number that probably will be a per student record. And again, that's good election year politics.
Yes. And last week, one of the big movers is that fracking came to Florida, and that's a big fight.
Yeah, the House passed a bill last week after hours of debate on the floor about a bill that relates to regulation of fracking, which has been a really controversial issue in other parts of the country, not so much in Florida up to this point, but places like Pennsylvania and Ohio, Oklahoma, North Dakota. It's been a controversial issue because of environmental concerns primarily, but the legislature, the House passed a bill that essentially creates a regulatory framework for fracking if it's to occur in Florida. And the most controversial part of the bill probably is that it would give the power to regulate fracking to the state, essentially the Department of Environmental Protection. And a lot of local governments have passed resolutions and other measures saying they don't want fracking. So this would it would preempt local control over that issue. So that's a very controversial part of it. Democrats and a lot of the environmental groups are just arguing that this is a welcome mat for fracking to come into Florida, and they're raising all kinds of concerns about that there's going to be problems with water contamination, water supply contamination, those sorts of issues. On the other side of the issue, the supporters of the bill say you know what, fracking could occur right now in Florida if someone wanted to do it. And there has been oil and natural gas drilling in Florida for a long time in a couple areas. Obviously, Florida's not Oklahoma or Texas, but in the northwest part of the state, in an area called Jay, Florida, there's been drilling there for a long time. There's some in southwest Florida. So it exists. Now, fracking has not been the preferred method, but drilling has happened. And so the proponents of the bill say, hey, this could be happening anyway. We need to get a regulatory framework in place. The other thing that they are saying is that part of this bill would require the Department of Environmental Protection to do a study of all sorts of ramifications of it, environmental, economic, so on. The department then would, after they do the study, there would be a moratorium on any fracking until the study's done. And then when it's done, ultimately rules would have to come back to the legislature for ratification. So, there's really two sides of this argument, and they're going at it pretty heavy. The question is what the Senate's going to do at this point. It has already passed the House, pretty much party line vote. There were a few Republicans voted against it, pretty much party line. And now it'll be in the Senate where the bill has moved through a couple committees at this point.
So, prediction, do you think?
I tend to think it's probably going to pass. I mean, the Senate is a bit more moderate than the House on some of these issues, but the bill is sponsored in the Senate by Garrett Richter, who is a lieutenant of the Senate president, and he's in his final year. And I think he's got some juice over there in the Senate, and so I think it's got a pretty decent chance. I wouldn't say definite, but I'd say decent.
Thanks, Jim. For more news about Florida government and politics, visit the Advances section of our website. Continue to come back to Capitol Dateline Online for daily postings.